This is an interview with Professor John Gaddis, a historian whose work helped reshape how we understand the Cold War as Chinese and Soviet archives opened and long-held beliefs and assumptions got tested. He's taught at Yale University for the last 25 years or so, and he is also the author of We Now Know, Rethinking Cold War History, as well as The Landscape of History, a book that touches on how historians think. You can read more about Professor Gaddis on her website, 6degrees.blog, or our Instagram page, 6degreesaway. Thank you so much and enjoy the interview.
This is Juan Gallo.
Yeah,
Hello, Professor.
I want.
I had a question, especially about like the later parts of your life and how you kind of changed your perspective
Yeah.
on Stalin and what the Cold War is about. I was
Mhm.
just wondering how you like came to that conclusion, and I guess what was the reaction from other people? Like, were they shocked or like did did you actually like
Mhm.
did other people like agree with you, or how was that?
Well, I don't know that it was that dramatic. First of all, thank you for referring to the later parts of my life. That's probably accurate, but a little sobering, you know. Um, I started out working only with American sources because that was all that was available. And so naturally, there was an American perspective on this that tended to assign responsibility to Stalin, particularly. And I was very much influenced by that. Later on, when we got access to Soviet sources, which was in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, the story became more complex. The story was that no, Stalin did not really want a Cold War. What he wanted was influence in Europe, in post-war Europe. Um, he wanted to serve influence for the Soviet Union. But he also, in the long run, expected a war with capitalism to develop. And that was because he was serious about ideology. He was a Marxist Leninist, and Marx and Lenin had taught that the capitalist system is inherently contradictory and exploitive, and sooner or later the capitalists would fall out with each other, and there would be a world proletarian revolution. So, on the one hand, you can say, sure, Stalin was interested in security for his state. How could he not be after that great war? You could say that Stalin was interested in having a sphere of influence, a protective sphere around that state, and that was certainly the case. But you can also say that he was expecting, ultimately, that there would be another great war, another world war, but this one would be the revolt of the workers. And he ironically expected that the next great war would be between the two chief capitalist countries, which was the United States and Great Britain. So he was completely surprised and caught off guard when the British and the Americans, when the West Europeans and the Americans all united to launch the policy of European reconstruction, which became the policy of containment. And this threw him off stride. It was not what ideology would have led him to expect. So there was an element of the unexpected in Stalin as well. That's a complicated answer, but Stalin was a reasonably complicated figure, and he wanted several different things at once. And I think maybe the way to look at it is to look at what he wanted in the short run, what he wanted in the middle run, and what he saw as the long-term prospect. And that's pretty well the way I would lay it out now, I think.
Tim?
Hello, I'm
I,
Timothy, and this is not really specifically about your work, but how has researching history and like I guess historiography changed as you've continued your work, especially with like internet and like
yeah. Mhm.
AI actually recently coming into
Sure.
research? How has that changed?
Mhm. Mhm. Well, there have been changes all along because in this field, um, when I started out, there were very few original documents available. And so I could work alongside the American process of declassifying its own documents. And as the State Department and the CIA and the Pentagon would come out with, or would release documents from top secret to open, then we had a flow of new documents to work with, and it was the opportunity for writing fresh things and new things just on that, just on the basis of American sources. But then as time went on and into the 1980s, we got access not just to West European sources, but we began to get access to Soviet and Chinese sources. And that expanded considerably after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. So for me, it was necessary just to completely rewrite my understanding of the Cold War. And I did that in a book that came out in 1997. It was called We Now Know, Reinterpreting Cold War History. And I went back and just reconsidered what I had written about Cold War history in the preceding 25 years or so in the light of what the Soviet documents and the Chinese documents revealed about what was happening on the other side. This actually upset a lot of people because they said that you can't go back and rewrite yourself. But of course you can, or you should. You must if you're a historian, if you have new documents to work with. You can't just be stuck with what you said on the basis of inadequate or fragmentary information. So that was somewhat controversial to do that. But it became even more controversial among my friends in political science because they said, we are trying to build models, and we are building our models on the evidence that you presented, Professor Gaddis. And we have these elaborate models in which we try to draw on the past to predict the future. But now you're messing up our models by providing new information. And we would say to them, but this is what's in the archives. And they would say to us, we don't want to look at the archives. What we want to do is to save our models. And so there was a very curious debate that was going on between those two disciplines, which, there are echoes of still today at this point. Do you pay more attention to new documents, or do you pay more attention to the models that you build, the interpretive models that you built from old documents? And I favor new documents. I favor rewriting and revising if necessary. I don't see anything wrong with that. I think that's the obligation of a historian.
If you want to come up here.
Amber? I was gonna. I have one. Okay.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Aubrey Cunningham. I was just wondering, now your perspective is kind of seen as like the framework for viewing the Cold War, but I know like back in the day it was seen as controversial. Can you give us some more insight into that and just how you kind of faced the backlash and how you stood on your research and your perspective?
Well, yes, it was a controversial field back particularly in the early days, partly because of a generational gap. At that time, there were still a lot of very distinguished senior officials who had participated in the Cold War. They were actually actors. They were not historians of the Cold War. And meanwhile, we, the younger historians, were working with the documents that were just coming out. And so there was a kind of a gap, a pretty serious gap between what we said as historians and what they remembered as participants in the events. And it would finally boil down to just arguments with senior officials who would look at us and they would say, how can you possibly know how it was in the Cold War? Because you were 3 years old at the time. And of course we were, but we later had documents and the senior officials did not have access to all the documents that we did. So it was a generational conflict at first. Then, partly under the pressure of the Vietnam War, it became a kind of ideological conflict between those who saw the United States as the main disrupting element in the international system because they were so upset about Vietnam and other issues from the 1960s and 1970s, and many of the rest of us who said, no, there were other disruptors of the system, namely the Soviet Union and China. And the system itself was a system of competing disruptors, a balance of power system. So there was an argument about that. What was the preconception that we brought to the understanding of the international system? Since that time, it seems to me the whole field has gone off in very different directions. There is no dominant school of thought, it seems to me, in the field as it stands now. But what you have is a lot of younger historians who are doing detailed research on particular aspects of the Cold War, but they have yet to build some kind of an overall sweeping synthesis of the Cold War. And that's kind of the normal process that historical investigation takes, because as you get to the point where you're actually overwhelmed with documents, you have more documents than you can manage. People just tend to carve out little particular niches, little particular corners to work on for their dissertations. And so they will do something like the Cold War implications of growing bananas in Mozambique or something like that, which is very specialized. And they don't really pull it together. And I think that's where we are right now, is with a highly fragmented field. There's a whole movement out there to, quote, decenter the Cold War from the history of the last half of the 20th century. On the argument that we have paid insufficient attention to what was happening in the third world, and elsewhere. And to some extent, that's true. We paid insufficient attention to it. But that doesn't mean that you can just ignore the major conflicts that were going on between the great powers, because those were influencing the smaller powers in the third world. So I don't much like the idea of decentering. I think we ought to just coexist with different levels of analysis as we approach this. But it's a very active field now, and there are a lot of younger people that are going into it and doing very detailed research. And I think we're all waiting for some kind of a sweeping synthesis that would pull together all of this micro research with macro viewpoints. I'm not sure we will ever get it completely, but that's anybody who could pull that off would get a lot of, it seems to me, applause from the rest of us. I would just add to this, if I could. One thing you have to understand, though, is that if you've been in this business for a long time, you sometimes get bored with your own topic. So a long time ago, like 20 years ago, I was beginning to get bored with Cold War history per se. Had been there and done that, written 5 or 6 books on that, and had taught it for a long time. So I got interested, first of all, in doing biography, and I did a major biography of George Kennan, who certainly is a Cold War figure. But writing biography was quite different from writing Cold War history. I also started writing what I would call books on historical method. So there was a book called The Landscape of History, which I published in 2002, just on how historians think, not about the Cold War specifically, but in general, how historians think, and the question whether history is a science or not, and if so, what kind of science. So it was fun to get off into that. And then, of course, I've been teaching at Yale for the last 25 years or so. The whole topic of grand strategy, which is much broader than the Cold War. Grand strategy, as we define it, goes all the way back to Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War. And so it requires a very broad viewpoint of quite a lot of history, pulling together things. And so I did a book on that. And then, having done all of those things, I suddenly discovered something from the new technological sources. I suddenly discovered digital newspapers, that there were online newspapers. And I discovered that Texas had a great digital newspaper project, the Texas Digital Newspaper Program, it's called. And I got very interested at that point in the history of the little town that I grew up in, about halfway between San Antonio and Laredo. It's the little town of Cotulla, about 3,000 inhabitants or so, not more. But always had the reputation of being the most violent town in Texas in the late 19th century, which was really saying something. There were a lot of violent towns in Texas in that period. But Cotulla seems to have won the award for that. People just kept shooting each other. And I wanted to know why. So I got interested in that and started reading the newspapers from the big cities covering Cthulhu, which could not itself sustain a newspaper because the newspaper editors kept getting shot. So all of that was interesting to write about, and it was completely different from anything I'd done before. But I had a great time doing it. So I'm one of those historians, you could say with a short attention span, although this extends over about a 50-year career, where it's been fun to experiment with subjects outside my own field. And that's part of the charm of doing history, is that it can point you in so many different directions. And particularly as new methodologies develop, like digital newspapers, it just opens up new opportunities for research, and that's exciting.
Hi, Professor. My name is
Yeah.
Guha.
Hi.
So I kind of had a question so we had to do an assignment where we had to interview multiple people and
Yeah.
kind of see how their youth and what they thought about their youth and their impact with the Cold War.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering how your youth and what you knew when you were younger regarding to the Cold War impacted your future studies.
Oh, I think there was one incident, probably, that is what I remember. And it was from October 1957. And it involved Sputnik, the first artificial satellite launched by the Russians in October of 1957. And that was a big deal because the Russians had zoomed out ahead of us in that capability. And it was a big deal because you could also, if you looked up in the sky at night, you could actually see the Russian satellite going over. It was not the actual satellite, which was only the size of a basketball, but it was the rocket casing from the launch, and it would tumble and catch the sunlight, and you could see this glimpse, So, uh, so I can remember on the first night that was available, climbing out onto the roof of our house, my family's house. I was 13 years old at that point, with a friend, and just lying back there on the roof, looking up at this Russian rocket that was going over our heads. And we looked at each other bug-eyed, and we said, Ruskies over Cthulhu, how could this be? So I think in a way that kind of kicked me into doing the Cold War. But it was a circular route because my parents were convinced that I had to do STEM. I had to become a scientist or an engineer or a doctor or something like that. And that never worked out. I was never any good at any of that. And ultimately, my mom, who was a high school librarian, said, well, maybe you could do library science. And so I went to Austin to study at UT library science, but you couldn't major in that. So I took some history courses on the side. And in my senior year, wrote a paper for a professor who was teaching Tudor Stuart history. Uh, and he called me into the office and he said, this is a good paper. You could publish this. And that was the first time I'd ever visited a professor in office hours. So, I said, how can I do that? And he said, you could go to graduate school. And I said, where? And he said, here. And so just at the last minute, in the second semester of my senior year, I decided what I wanted to do in life, and that was to be a historian. I don't recommend that for the rest of you guys. I mean, you should be thinking earlier and more systematically about that. But I was profoundly lucky that somebody just called me in and said, this is something you're good at. This is something you could do. And after that, everything was clear, and it was a very fast progression through, the advanced degrees, the MA, the PhD, and so on. And it was a good time to enter the history field because universities were expanding in that period. And the Cold War was opening up as a new subject, and I was able to get in on the ground floor of it. But I credit the responsibility for all of this, I think, goes to the Soviet rocket scientists that launched Sputnik over our heads in Cthulhu back when I was 13 years old. That's what did it.
Jackson? Yeah, so something, soccer.
Maybe something like China.
Okay, Channel.
So,
Hello.
I
It's I was wondering
you guys are getting a back strain leaning over like that.
I was
Much
wondering
better. Thank you. Go
how
ahead.
like kind of now with China and kind of you're seeing this indirect war almost with like the tariffs
Mhm.
and how that's kind of you kind of look at the Cold War and look at what's happening now and kind of see, I guess, relations, but also like key differences that you think should be separated from both.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, I think it's a good question because there is a Cold War that's developing basically between the U.S. and China. At one level, if you were to go back and look at all of world history, you would say there have been Cold Wars all the way through because there have been many confrontations between great powers that did not lead to hot wars, not least the Anglo-American relationship in the 19th century. Um, so there's Cold War with a lowercase is what that would be, but then Cold War with the capital letters, what we had with the Soviet Union. A lot of people see it coming back now with China as well. And that's going to be the question. What can we learn from the experience of the Cold War with the Soviet Union in dealing with the Chinese? What are the similarities? What are the differences? The great difference, I think, is that the Chinese have been extraordinarily successful with their economy. They have lifted up that nation out of complete poverty to a higher level and at a faster level than anybody else ever has done in world history over the last half century or so. And that is something that the old Soviet Union never achieved. It's something it promised through its ideological commitment to Marxism, Leninism, but it was never able to achieve that. The Chinese did it very cleverly by becoming thriving market capitalists. Nobody is more capitalist in the world today than the Chinese, but they call it communism. So Deng Xiaoping and others who succeeded him have totally flipped the original meaning of communism to be market capitalism, and they practice it with a vengeance and with great success. So that's a new kind of challenge that we did not face with the old Soviet Union. At the same time, China is a great power within a certain geographical area. And so it has spheres of influence. It's surrounded by neighbors. Some of the neighbors are friendly, some of the neighbors are hostile. And that situation is very much like what the old Soviet Union faced as well. Uh, the other thing that they have in common is that they're both authoritarian systems. And part of the weakness of an authoritarian system is that it does not have orderly means of replacing its leaders. You just have to wait for the leader to get senile and creaky and eventually die before you can replace that leader. And that always leads to disarray in the conduct of policy as it did, certainly under Stalin, and certainly under Brezhnev, and as it did certainly particularly under Mao, who went crazy in his last 10 years or so. So that can be very weakening for a country in the absence of a regular means of selecting the leader can be quite a problem. You could say we don't have an orderly method of selecting our leaders either. And in some ways, you'd be right if you look at American politics over the last 10 or 15 years or so. But at the same time, it's a regular process. We know what's going to happen. We know when it's going to happen. We don't necessarily know who's going to come out on top. But we do maintain, and I hope can preserve, checks and balances on executive authority. And there's no way they can do that in an authoritarian system. So that is a huge weakness. And George Kennan, who I wrote the biography of, pointed that out. He said one of the reasons containment will work, he's writing back in 1947, is that if we can just hold the line and prevent a world war and prevent appeasement of the Russians at the same time. But sooner or later, they will self-destruct themselves. The contradictions in their own system will bring it, cause it to collapse. And of course, that's what happened in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. It just imploded. And so you had this remarkable thing of a great power sitting on top of thousands of nuclear weapons that you would have thought it would have used to preserve itself, not using any of them and just peacefully imploding, going poof like that. And that was totally unexpected. So this idea of authoritarianism itself is a big difference that it seems to me we have with China, and it's a weakness China will face over the long term as she gets older.
I have a question. Okay, so our class has been debating whether or not we're in a third Red Scare.
Uh-huh.
And so I was wondering what you thought about that kind of aspect on the United States right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, it depends on who you think the Reds are. So the first Red Scare, which was in the late Woodrow Wilson administration, was in the immediate aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, and there were thought to be Russian revolutionaries, anarchists, and whatnot running around this country, blowing up, setting off bombs, all of that sort of thing. And so many of them were exported forcibly from the country. Second Red Scare was in the early Cold War, the era of McCarthyism, when there were fears, some of them perfectly justified, about spies in the top levels of the U.S. government that had reported on things like the development of the atomic bomb and were sabotaging early covert operations. But it became greatly exaggerated as domestic politics took over. The infamous Senator Joe McCarthy exploited all of this. And that was the second Red Scare. I don't think we're approaching anything quite like that now. There is something that's going on that has to do with Chinese who are in this country. And what's greatly different here is that there are a lot more Chinese who came to this country and have come to this country in the last quarter century than there ever were Russians who came here. We had almost no Russian students studying in the United States. There are tens of thousands of Chinese students who come and studied in the United States. The combination of that, together with China's zooming ahead in so many technological areas, has created a kind of panic in this regard. But I don't think it's approached anything like what we had in the two earlier Red Scares. It seems to me it's just an uneasiness about the allegiance of particularly Chinese who come from China and who will be going back to China. And are they carrying secrets to us? But we also have something else which is quite unprecedented, I think, in the history of international relations. But you guys know all about it. And this is TikTok. Is it really true that TikTok is a sinister Chinese plot? And are your minds being corrupted, even as we speak, by TikTok as you consult your famous iPhones, and whatnot? That's something new. We didn't have that before. So you guys are going to decide what the answer to that is.
I don't know, maybe a little worse.
Do you think TikTok is a sinister Chinese tool?
Well, that's what he was asking you.
Oh, he's asking.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, what?
Do you think it's a sinister, Jackson?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, well, come on,
Do I
come
get
on.
to, like, in my argument
You need to come closer to the microphone.
Yeah, I need to hear you.
as to why it is?
Yes.
Yes.
No, I'm bad.
Jackson is our resident person who always comes up with the alternate perspective.
Okay, good.
That's Jackson.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
The main thing that I've noticed is that in China, when they get TikTok, well, they only get it for like 1 hour a week or on the weekends or whatever.
Yeah.
They're only limited to STEM videos, so they only
Yeah.
do like science and math and all this writing.
Yeah.
In like Western Europe and in America, you get like all this nonsensical content designed to like distract you and like there's no time restrictions. I mean, you get access to the STEM videos too, but it's not like forced.
Yeah. Well, Jackson, if you were to present that argument or would have presented that argument to the late Senator Joe McCarthy, he would have said, Jackson, that is exactly what they're trying to do. That's the plot. Infect your minds, so that we take advantage of your weaknesses and your short attention spans and all of that. And meanwhile, we are rigidly disciplined, confining our youth to an hour a week on TikTok. I think that's a little bit oversimplified. First of all, I think that the ability of the Chinese to control their own people and to control their own youth, while it's surely better than ours is not quite that good. And I think I have no doubt that there's a considerable underground network that is overcoming some of those constraints, even in China, for sure. I think that's also an oversimplified view of American youth. Of course, you're fascinated by TikTok and you're fascinated by a lot of other things. But I can remember when people were thinking American youth are going to be corrupted any day now. By what? By Elvis, of course, and rock and roll. And later by the Beatles and so on and so forth, And so this worry about American youth becoming corrupted is an old one that goes way back. American youth are always on the verge of being corrupted. So so far it has not happened. So far, you guys grow up to be solid and responsible citizens, I think, for the most part. You grow out of whatever it is that's upsetting your elders. And I have a good deal of confidence in you. I see a lot of you guys, older versions of you guys, meaning university students, and I'm impressed with them. I have a lot of respect for them. So this doesn't worry me too much, really.
Thank you.
Okay.
Do we have time for one more question?
Do we have time for one more question?
Sure.
That's the other question.
Yes. I can ask.
Hi.
Hi.
To what extent do you think the Western victory of the Cold War is overplayed? Do you think it actually has added that much to Western hegemony, or not as much as I guess we've been taught?
I think it was, of course, very exciting and very gratifying in the way that it happened 30 years ago, chiefly because it did not happen in a violent way, because it was a peaceful change, and that was a big surprise. But I also think it had some unfortunate effects on us. I think it made us, meaning the U.S., hugely overconfident. And I think in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse, we decided that there was no other great power anywhere in the world, and we were free now to impose our values on other societies. And so this movement that really begins in the Clinton administration continues through the second Bush administration and Obama to an extent, promoting democratic values throughout the world, regardless of the historical background of other countries and cultures and whatnot. I think it was a big mistake, because what it meant was that we were trying to tell other people how to live their lives. And people don't like to be told that. They can admire from afar what a country may have done in its political institutions and its economic prosperity and all of that sort of thing. But when the country starts instructing them on here's how you can do it too, no wonder they began to resent that. And I think we got off into that, particularly with the efforts to spread democracy throughout the world. But I think in particular, the neglect of how this would affect some of the other great powers out there. So it clearly did alarm the Chinese, but more particularly, it greatly alarmed the Russians. And I think we just blew it with Russia. We had with Russia a great power that had been our opponent, that was predisposed now to becoming our ally, it seems to me, in the 1990s. And we just blew it. We blew it by trying to impose capitalism on them, market economy on them, without realizing what that was going to do, how easily that could be exploited by the oligarchs in Russia, but also through the expanding of NATO and toward Russia actually taking into account, taking into NATO former territories of the Soviet Union. And sure, as that push began to happen, we forgot what NATO was for. It originally was for the purpose of containing the old Soviet Union, and that had been accomplished by 1991. But we kept going. And now, having come close to pushing it with Ukraine, having come close to bringing Ukraine within the European Union, all of that kind of thing, that has provoked Putin to the extent that he has now started a tragic war with Ukraine. And I think we bear some responsibility for that because he saw us as trying to pull Ukraine into our own orbit. And if you ask the question, well, how do we feel, if somebody tries to pull a neighbor into their orbit? Well, look at Cuba. We almost started a world war over Cuba in the time of the missile crisis, and whatnot. So you can expect a great power to be sensitive along its borders, and that's what is happening here. So nobody knows how this is going to come out. But I think a lot of the blame for what is happening right now with Ukraine just reflects our own amnesia with the question of how to build a solid peace. If you look at the peace settlements that worked well, they were the ones that brought in former adversaries. And I would cite the peace settlement after the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, which brought France back into the system. I would cite the peace settlements after World War II, which brought Germany and Japan back into the system. And the ones that failed were the ones that excluded great powers from the system, as in the Versailles Treaty ending World War I, which excluded both Germany and Russia from that, with the Russian Revolution having taken place. And somehow we just forgot that principle that when you defeat an adversary, you should be then generous to that adversary, not coercive to that adversary, if you want to build long-term friendships, because those countries are not going to go away. You may have defeated them, but they're still going to be there. There's always going to be Russia on the map. There's always going to be China on the map, and they will not always be carbon copies of us. Sorry, your generation doesn't know what a carbon copy is. It's an old term, from pre-computer era. But just think of it as making copy 2 or copy 3 with the computer, and you get the idea. Okay?
You last.
Thank you.
All right.
I guess you may know, but when you're studying the Cold War, you're sort of a rock star. So we're really thrilled that we got a chance to talk to you like this. It's
That's
a thrill for us. So I wanted you to know that.
that's so weird because my own students do not tend to regard me as a rock star.
Well, maybe they should.
They have a lot of other opinions, but rock star is not among them.